Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. Hopefully you've got a coffee, you've got a notepad and you're settled in for an hour of free learning and the latest stats and the latest best practice tips and case studies. My name's Stuart Banbury and I'm joined by Darren Cavaney today from Comms 2.0, and we're going to take a look at the largest ever public sector social media piece of research that has ever been done. We've just finished this with the guys at Comms 2.0 and today we're going to take a look at the results, some of the key findings and what this means to you guys out there, the comms professionals out there in public sector world. So that's me on the right, Stuart Banbury. I'm the marketing manager here at Social Signing. The gentleman on the left, who I said doesn't look like a James Bond villain, is Darren Cavaney. So I'd like to say hello, Darren.
Hi, thank you, Stuart. Nice to be with you today here from very tropical Birmingham.
So we're going to be your host today. We're going to walk through what our key findings were and how we can start to capitalise on some of the opportunities and overcome some of the challenges that they have flagged up. Just a couple of bits of housekeeping before we get started. So everyone's microphones will be muted. If you want to submit a question into the chat box in the top right hand corner of the YouTube panel, then you need to be logged into YouTube to do that. Also, please do join in the conversation, tweet along your thoughts and ideas by using the hashtag SOCMed18. If you do have to dip off early, don't worry about that. We'll be sending out a link to watch the webinar recording again tomorrow, along with a copy of where you can download the accompanying guidebook to this survey. So I know we've got a mixture of customers and non-customers in the room. So for those of you that aren't as familiar with ourselves, just a couple of slides to introduce the two organisations that have conducted this research. So Social Signing, we're a complete social media management platform. We work with hundreds of organisations across the public and private sector to help them create these really powerful customer experience moments on social media and start to drive real world outcomes that social media can provide. We work with a range of different clients, as you can see on the slide in front of you, everyone from transport to utilities to leisure, hospitality, retail, about 70 or 80 different local authorities, police forces, fire, education. So a real cross section. One of the things I love about my job is I get to see how all these different organisations are harnessing social media, aligning it to their wider corporate strategies and driving some really kind of powerful outcomes and some real behavioural change. The final slide on us before I hand you over to Darren is this is the platform that all of our customers use. So as you can see, it's broken down into distinct modules. So each module is based on the needs of a department within an organisation around social media. So we've got a customer service module, and that's where you create these powerful customer experience moments. You drive down those response times, you create a single customer view, and you collaborate with your colleagues. We've got a marketing and comms module where you create and schedule a rich calendar of content and then use a suite of reports to see what content is sticking with your audience. And we've also got a PR module. So that's where we do all that social listening, that media monitoring, and listen to all that chatter around your brand, around your industry, and really start to understand what your customers care about.
Thank you, Stuart, and hi everyone again. So yeah, Comms 2.0, some of you will be aware of, hopefully. It's been around for almost 7 years now, and it exists really to help promote and deliver the best in emerging comms, PR, digital marketing thinking. The website, for those that haven't looked, it's a little treasure trove of hopefully comms insights and learning. There are almost 1,400 posts and case studies and free resources on the website now. That's come from over 500 contributors, so not just public but also private sector thinking in there as well. So it's somewhere to really go and have a look at who's doing what in terms of communications best practice these days, and there's a really big bias towards public sector, and social media is probably the most popular category on the website, so do have a look at that if you haven't already. Obviously there's a Twitter feed off the back of that, so this is our official Comms 2.0 social media platform of choice. There are almost 1,400 of you on that account now, so it's a really nice engaged community of people, some of whom are hopefully on the webinar today. With my kind of consultancy hat on, Creative Communicators is my business. So a big chunk of what I've been doing, particularly this year, but certainly over the past 3 years, has been looking at public sector and how do we nail best practice social media. There are examples of best practice in pretty much every organisation I've worked with, but how do you crack social media against the backdrop of, for many, reducing team size, but increasing demands and expectations? So that's a real challenge right now for comms people out there today.
Okay, so let's get started. So I always include this slide just to kind of set the scene and set some context in terms of how social media has evolved over the last 17, 18 years. So back in 2001, in the early days of MySpace, those of you that remember that, it was all about growing your community and growing your followers. And that persisted for around 10 or so years. And then about 2010, we saw the first significant change start to take place. And that was when these brands and these organizations had developed these communities. And now it was all about how were they going to start leveraging them. So the currency at that time was things like likes and retweets and shares and followers, of course, but nothing that really kind of drove any real business impact. And then probably around 3 or 4 years ago, we started to see the second significant shift start to take place. And I think this is when organizations woke up to the fact that social media, it wasn't this passing fad that was going to go away. And so now it was a case of, right, how can we now get social media activity to align and contribute to broader business goals? And it's by doing this that we can make social media really strategic and we start to elevate it to boardroom level. So for an example, it might be shifting customer service inquiries to social media or live chat and starting to leverage the cost savings associated with that. It might be driving traffic to your website to drive online form completions, inquiries, even some e-commerce activity, and then attributing your ROI to actual social media activity. And from a PR perspective, a brand, organization, reputation perspective, it might be actually managing your brand online. It might be listening to what your customers are saying about your services and actually taking all of that social data, feeding it back into the business, and then using it to actually develop your products and services. So I think it's a really exciting time now going forward for social media as we're starting to see it get much more strategic. So just to kind of set the scene for some of the data that we're going to jump into in a second, I thought we'd have a look at what social media headlines have been around in 2018. So of course you've got the whole fake news scandal. Now typically this kind of consists of clickbait and people kind of manipulating news stories, but actually this is now being penalized by the social network. So if you are actively looking to drive clicks and retweets and shares and get people to engage that way, then some of your content can be penalized by some of the social networks. Obviously, some of people like Facebook are now taking away some of the functionality, so you can no longer edit images and title text associated with a post. Data security. So probably the most recent headline in terms of some of the data breaches that we're seeing around networks like Facebook. So what we're seeing off the back of this is now Facebook is actively asking for pages to be re-authenticated and also just temporarily suspending third-party applications from adding new Facebook pages to their system. So obviously we see this as very early days and this will change a lot over the coming weeks and months, but even this early on, we're seeing some changes by some of the social networks. Human comms has been another big theme this year. So we're seeing obviously less broadcasting, more meaningful one-to-one engagement, more storytelling, and obviously quite a few of the social networks are now prioritizing real conversations in their news feeds. And obviously we can't get too far away from our favorite acronym GDPR. So obviously social media is probably the grey areas in terms of social media. But obviously there's lots of considerations there around legal consent to store data, the ability to delete and supply data. And of course, I think the main one is moving away from the technology and actually making sure your people are trained on best practices and policies and what they can and can't do. So the study that we're going to take a look at, this is a brief snapshot of some of the key ingredients. So we surveyed over 120 organisations right across the public sector. So from local gov to housing, blue light services, central government, healthcare, education. We then took all of those subsectors and we compared the different results against each other to start identifying the key trends. We surveyed comms professionals, customer service professionals, social media managers, and we asked them questions around comms, social media, customer service, and the whole wider digital transformation piece. So let's jump in. Our first finding was that overwhelmingly demand for social media is accelerating. So just to give you some kind of context, so last year when we conducted a similar survey, we saw that 78% of local government organisations saw an increase in social media. This year that's jumped up to 86%. So almost a 10% increase in social media demand. Some of the key sectors that we're seeing this in include healthcare, emergency services, housing associations. So I think across the board, we're seeing the demand for social media and for the delivery of services on social media is only going to increase. So what we're going to do now for each of the top 10 stats that I'm going to talk through, after each of those, I'm going to hand you over to Darren, and he's going to talk about some of the best practices, some of the best examples, and some of the top tips that he sees as he's on his travels up and down the country.
Thank you, Stuart. Yeah, I guess for me right now in, where are we, April 2018, we can't talk about public sector social media without a quick reference to Doncaster, and I think they're on the webinar, so hello to Doncaster Council. For me, the big, we generally know what works on social media now. You can, the savvy comms person can spot very easily what's some really great content for social and what isn't. The trick is, for me, it's about creating the time and the room to be creative. We know that social media can't be a 5-minute bolt on to everything else you've got to do in that busy world. The people that are doing it best are creating that extra time to be really, really effective on social media. So for me, Doncaster Council, I've kind of raised the creative bar for all of us in the public sector, actually. So I'm a huge fan of what Rob and Liam in the team there have been doing. A couple of examples there you can see on the screen, which are a couple of my personal favourites, but there are so many. What I really like is they're doing little mini campaigns which are creative, they're engaging, they're fun, they're building their follower numbers, they're building their engagement rates, but they're also tackling the bread and butter issues which residents care about. And if you're in local government, you'll know what they are. And it is the bin collections, the clean streets, the potholes, the gritting. This is the bread and butter of what local government does day in, day out. It does it really, really well, but we have to tell that story on social media. What I really like about Doncaster, and they're not alone in this, there's many others doing equally interesting work, but Doncaster will use their example here. They're doing it in a fun and engaging way. And when I'm on my travels now, and I've just in the past month, I've been up in Scotland, I've been in Wales, I've been in various places in England, and time again, unprompted, people are saying, oh, Doncaster are doing some really interesting things. So for me, they've really lifted the creative bar for all of us. And so, but if you talk to the team there, they will tell you they are making the time to be creative. And I think for me, that's the real trick.
Okay, thanks for that, Darren. So to jump into our second finding that we revealed. So what we're seeing here is that social media team size change over the last 12 months is predominantly staying the same. So probably across the board, what we're seeing is that really the resources and the extra heads aren't really going into the social media team size. There is a bit of disparity. There are some areas where we are seeing some kind of extra resources going in. So, for example, in education and slightly in housing and local government. But I think there is a real kind of need for better resource to go into this area, because if we're not giving people a fantastic first experience the first time they choose to talk to us on social media, then they're just going to revert back to email, to telephone, to those more traditional, to more costly customer service and contact channels. So the key here really is actually meeting that growth in demand with a growth in resource. I know it's easier said than done, but if we are going to start influencing behavior and getting people to see digital channels as the way to interact with us and to access services, then we need to give them the very best first experience on those channels. So Darren, over to you to have a listen about what you're seeing at the moment.
Yeah, I think for me, we can expect to see. Obviously, this is the second year that we've run this survey now, and the results are that social demand is increasing, which we probably could have guessed, but it's interesting to see that those are the facts of the matter. So we can expect this to continue. So for me, two things. It's about really understanding that demand. It'll be different for every team and every organisation, but we need to be measuring and managing that demand. We also need to be reporting it back to our management teams, to our customer services teams, to ensure that they can see the scale of the demand that's coming in. Where within that, where are the opportunities to have really great engagement and to help provide better services for residents, for customers, for citizens? So I think the management and demand is the first thing, and then linked to that is having a really clear communication strategy, because actually we all know it's very easy to go the other way and spend too much time on social media. Equally, that's not always the correct thing to do. So for me, it's where does social media fit into our comms mix and our comms strategies? Where can we get genuine returns from it that benefit our audiences, and to give ourselves the chance to do the really creative, engaging stuff which we know will work. Quite like this as an example. Most people in the public sector, if you ask them, will say they're really, really busy. It's a busy place, and in a communications team right now, it's a very busy place to be, for sure. Sometimes though, it's about how you use the resource that you've got. Now, when we ran the Comms 2.0 Unawards last year, we had I think the highest number of entries we had for a category was best social media accounts. This was a highly competitive category, as you can imagine, with some fantastic accounts all across the public sector. The winner was a really interesting one, and this was the Give Blood NHS account. And this was an account that did some amazing things and did some brave things. So in the face of some really quite horrible racist abuse on the account, Melissa Thermidor, the comms person there who was running the account, did something really brave and actually challenged what was coming in. She challenged it, and as a result created a kind of on the hoof campaign that had some fantastic results in terms of generating additional blood donors from Black and Asian communities. She is a team of one. What she did as one person was quite incredible, actually. And I think we have to remember that actually it's not just about size. We would all like more resource, of course we would, but it's how you use the resource that you've got. And for me, that does come back into understanding the demand, having a smart plan, and using the resources as best you can.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Darren. The next question we asked was, which is the most popular network for customer services? And again, we saw a real split here. So across local gov, central gov, healthcare, it was Twitter that was the predominant network for inbound customer service inquiries. Actually, for emergency services, housing and education, we saw that it was Facebook. So this is quite interesting. So what does this tell us? Is it a case of different customer segments? Is it different demographics for accessing each of these services? So a real kind of a real mixture of results here. But what's quite interesting is that actually, again, to give some context for 2017, so last year when we asked local government, it was around 73% for Twitter in terms of inbound customer service inquiries. This year, we've seen that level off much more, and it's around 53% of customer service inquiries coming in on Twitter and a growth in Facebook. So what does this tell us? Is it that Facebook as a customer service channel is growing? Is it that we've got channels like Messenger and kind of WhatsApp that are springing up in terms of customer services? We're certainly seeing that a lot in the private sector. So again, a real split here across the different subsectors, which was quite interesting to see. So I'm going to hand you over to Darren now just to share some of his insights on this.
Thanks. Yes, really interesting, wasn't it, to see that we've got local, central government and the NHS where Twitter still is the dominant platform, but actually the complete opposite in the emergency services, housing and education. Fascinated to know why that is, actually, and perhaps some further questioning there. What's really interesting, I think, for me, some of the organisations that do customer social media best, Leeds City Council, again, I've mentioned them before, but I'll very happily reference them again. The trick there for me, that this was customer services led. So this was Nick Moore in the customer services team and his colleagues working very closely there with the excellent comms team at Leeds to say, we need to embrace social media. It needs to become a fully fledged customer contact channel, just the same as email and telephone or letter. And they've done that. I mean, what they did was really interesting. They set up dedicated customer services accounts on both Twitter and Facebook. I think Nick will tell you that a bit similar to our results, actually, Twitter was the predominant force. I think they've got 24,000 followers to their dedicated Twitter account, which is a really impressive figure. But in recent times, Facebook has caught up a bit. They're different dynamics, different types of questions, a different environment for the customer services people to use and to respond on. But I think the fact they took that approach really early on, and I think they're seeing the benefits of that now.
Okay, great. Thanks, Darren. The next question that we asked was, who responds to customer service inquiries in your organisation? So still, overwhelmingly, it's the comms guys that are picking up those kind of first line customer service inquiries. Although there's been a lot of talk over the last few years in terms of how can we engage customer services much earlier on in terms of inbound social media messages, we're still seeing that predominantly it's the comms guys that are picking these up. We are seeing in local government that there are some kind of inroads being made. And, you know, it's certainly an area I think that can be kind of built out over the future. And that it's kind of, you know, if we can engage those customer service people much earlier on, that these are the people with the information around customer service, with the answers to those questions. And again, it's a way that if we can provide a great service on social media, we can start to move or start to influence behaviour in terms of that channel shift, which I know a lot of organisations are looking for.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. So yeah, we talk about channel shift a lot, don't we, and other kind of buzzwords. I think for me, some of the really easy wins can be really significant. So the example that I've put up here, and there are many more that I could have used, but this is probably my favourite. So this was from Kirklees Council and their excellent communications team. Vicky Harris, who works in the comms team and has done all sorts of things with social media and digital comms and email. What she actually did was take herself out of the office for half a day and sat with customer services, which doesn't sound like the most revolutionary thing in the world. But if you ask comms people who are genuinely really busy, that can be quite a task in itself, just to get out of the office for half a day. What she did was she sat with her customer services colleagues for that half a day and listened in to the types of calls that were coming in. Now, we know some of the spikes in customer services calls, and you talk to your customer services teams and they'll be able to tell you what they are. All teams have those spikes across the year, across the seasons. What Vicky did though, which was really interesting, she did that and then she looked at the opportunities for where the comms team, through good creative content on social media, on email and on website, could help the customer services team. So the backdrop was, for many teams, customer services had a bit of a cut in terms of team numbers. And Monday, for all UK councils, I think it's probably fair to say, Monday is the busiest day. So on a Monday, they're literally struggling to answer the calls quickly. So Vicky said, well, why don't we encourage the non-urgent calls to make those calls on a Tuesday, a Wednesday, a Thursday, or a Friday? This is the most blindingly obvious thing to do, actually, isn't it, when you think about it? Of course, why wouldn't you do this? But the fact that Vicky took the time out to go and sit with them to understand it and then created some really simple but engaging content, they had a reduction of calls into the call centre on a Monday of 15%. Now, obviously, that customer contact team knows the cost to the organisation of each call. So you can put a financial benefit to that reduction. That, for me, is the best and most simple example of channel shift I can find. And I bet that customer services team loves Vicky for doing it. So it's how we do more of this. Comms and customer, they need to be intertwined and working together really closely.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that, Darren. So yeah, so quite often it's the simple ideas that have the most impact. So we looked at what are the new social media channels being implemented and adopted over the last 12 months. So overwhelmingly, although we surveyed and gave an option for every single recently launched network, it was Instagram and Facebook Live that came out on top. So what does this tell us? I think obviously Instagram was the fastest growing social network of 2017. And also there's been a lot of talk around Facebook Live lately, and particularly the way that the algorithm within Facebook is now prioritizing video, live, and visual content much higher in their newsfeed. So people, comms professionals, are obviously seeing this as an opportunity to engage and to get their messaging and their content in front of their followers. But obviously, in terms of good practice marketing and good practice comms, it's not just a case of jumping on the bandwagon and adopting every new channel that's launched. It's a case of really stepping back, doing that research, understanding where your audience is and the best place to engage with them. And I think it's always best to actually do a great job on one or two channels rather than to spread yourself too thinly over 3 or 4 channels.
Absolutely, would definitely echo that, Stuart. What was interesting there, wasn't it, that actually it was Instagram that was slightly more popular than Facebook Live in that past 12 months as a new tool to adopt. Absolutely, it comes back to the business case, doesn't it? For a busy team, where is the business case? If the business case says we should actually be doing something to promote this particular service on Instagram, let's explore that. I guess for all of us, what we're going to have to wait and see a little bit is, the recent Facebook issues, which we're all completely aware of. How will that affect our use as communications people, but more importantly, customers' use as users of these channels? Will there be no effect at all? Or actually, when we do this survey again in 12 months' time, will we have seen a drop-off? I mean, we genuinely don't know, do we? So that's a kind of watching brief, really. I suspect the numbers of users involved in Facebook, it's still going to be a significant channel, whatever happens. But very much we need to keep a watching brief on that one, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to kind of flag up one of the comments we've had in the chat. So David Bailey, who's the social lead over at Digital Policing at the moment, who's joining us. So hi, David. It's a great comment by David, who's put out there that they're implementing a channel choice strategy rather than channel shift. So if you've got the resources, it's great that you can give people the ability to contact you on whichever channel they're most comfortable speaking to you. So if you have the resources to do that, that's great, rather than trying to dictate to people. And again, that's a great way to really get that digital engagement.
Yeah, a couple of quick examples, Stuart. There's some brilliant Instagram accounts around. I think sometimes there's a knee-jerk reaction to, we need to have an Instagram account. This is often a request that comes from others outside of a comms team into a comms team. If the comms team thinks there's a real business benefit for doing it, then I think it can work really, really well. A couple of good examples I've seen on my most recent travels. First one on the left is Natural Resources Wales. This is an organisation with a fantastic product, an amazing natural landscape, and they've got staff out and about on the front line delivering really important work, delivering sustainability work across Wales with some fantastic imagery that's being shared on a regular basis. So if Instagram is one of your favourites, do take a look at their account. My hometown, Birmingham, I think it's Guy who runs this particular account mostly. Some fantastic images of this fair city. So again, if you want to see some really good public sector use of an Instagram account with a really engaged following, do take a look at those 2 examples.
Okay, great. Let's crack on. So the next question was around the theme of advertising, particularly social media advertising. So there's been a lot of talk about this, and particularly the way that social networks are changing their algorithms to encourage more advertising spend. So what did we see in the public sector across the last 12 months? So again, I think the main takeaway here was the fact that for over 50% of all organizations are increasing advertising spend. So what was once seen as probably a bit of a luxury or something that was just used quite intermittently is now kind of commonplace across the whole of the public sector. We know that organic reach is falling year on year, particularly in Facebook. I think it's down to kind of single figures in terms of organic reach. So if you've got a really important message, a great campaign, a really important piece of news, and you want it to be seen by even your own followers, you do need to put some budget behind it now. So I think that's really important, and obviously that's reflected in the way that we're seeing advertising being adopted right across the public sector.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. I think just a quick point on that. 2 years ago, when I was working with comms teams in and around the public sector, it was generally the minority of teams that had taken part in social media advertising campaigns. That's really flipped around, and it's a very different picture now. Most individuals in the comms team have at some point during a campaign been involved with some form of social media advertising. So that's good to see. So I think the skills and the experience and the knowledge has really been spread out across public sector teams. Sometimes I think what's happening was, again, a little bit like back in the day, you'd get a demand from an internal team asking the comms team to produce a leaflet, we need a leaflet, we need a website, we need a microsite, we need X, Y, and Z. I'm seeing a little bit of that now in terms of social media advertising. So for me, there has to be a provable demand. There has to be a recognisable return on investment. So recruitment campaigns on social media are really great examples of where you can prove the return on investment to maybe a slightly skeptical chief exec or somebody internally who's not quite sure of the benefits. When you can really point to a return, so a recruitment campaign or maybe a paid for event, I think that's when the social media advertising in the public sector can really, really prove its worth.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it comes back to, as Darren was saying, there's got to be an ROI. It's got to be measurable and calculable. It comes back to those kind of smart objectives. So, but if you can start to, join the dots and kind of work back from your social media spend and actually prove those real world outcomes, you started on a small scale, you prove the business case. Hopefully, you can then go to the people that hold the purse strings for more investment. Okay, so moving on. So the next theme that we looked at was all around CRM, and particularly integrating social media with those wider customer relationship practices. So we didn't really see much of a change compared to this time 12 months ago. So overwhelmingly, a lot of the people that we surveyed still said that in the whole, social media wasn't integrated with their wider CRM practices. So I think for me, this is one of the main opportunities that really kind of jumped out from these findings, because if we can start to connect social media and integrate it within the contact center, within the wider CRM processes, that's where we can really start to deliver those very informed, very effective interactions, which again help to encourage people and get them to see our digital channels as the way to speak to us going forward. So, with software now going forward, it's much, much easier to start to integrate your social media platforms, your telephony systems, your email systems all together. And once you can start to create that single customer view about your customers, you can really start to understand what they care about, why they're speaking to you, and then even use that to kind of create some great customer satisfaction moments, some first-time resolutions in terms of cost-effective customer care, but also maybe to start identifying maybe some revenue opportunities and where we can actually start to commercialize some of our assets, some of our services, and actually start to offset some of those kind of budget cuts that we're all facing.
Thanks, Stuart. Yeah, I think as well some really an example that I really liked recently during the last bout of severe weather that we had up in Yorkshire. Bradford Council, Albert Freeman did a really nice piece of work across social media that if you've got kids at school and it's snowing, the most important thing in your world that day is to find out if the school is open or not the next day, because this can have a real impact on people's lives and arrangements. What Albert did was really simple but really nicely done on social media with some really engaging content to talk about the issue, but encouraging people to sign up to email alerts. This was really successful, and I think it was just in 4 or 5 days he managed to get over 6,000 brand new email subscribers just to severe weather alerts. Those are all then people that he can point to the latest web page with the up-to-date information that then comes in, that then can potentially reduce the number of calls going into the call center. So again, it's all about that really smart working across social, but understanding the influence and the impact that email and web can have to reduce the number of calls going into a really busy call centre, particularly when it snows, because we know that is an absolute spike for many in the public sector.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Darren.
So there we've got the example there. That's the second mention for Leeds. I'm not being paid by Leeds, by the way. They're just one of the great examples. So another hooray for Leeds City Council.
Okay, so moving on to some more broader themes now and kind of expanding some of our questioning out from purely social and CRM and digital to look at more digital investments and digital kind of transformation pieces. So we asked everyone kind of what the level of digital investment had been over the last 12 months. Had it changed? Had it gone up? Had it gone down? And what we saw that actually there was a real investment, whether that was a significant increase or just an increase. There is a real appetite now to start to get the ball rolling with some of these wider transformation pieces. Obviously, that's in the face of kind of budget cuts and kind of other difficulties. But I think that there is a real appetite now to start to use some of these digital technologies and these digital kind of services to actually start getting people to speak to them online. But the key here is really being able to offer end-to-end services online. It's no good kind of pushing people to different channels. That can create quite a jarring experience. And again, if you do that, people will quite often refer back to their kind of default way of contacting you, whether that's email or whether that's telephone. So the key here, again, is being able to resolve queries and kind of service people on the channel that they come to you on.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. So on that, and I guess really what we sometimes forget about when we talk about social media are our staff. Now, if we could get all of our staff as ambassadors, understanding and supporting our efforts on social media, we'd have a really informed workforce and an army of people out in our communities really understanding and sharing the messages shared by our public sector colleagues. Easier said than done, I know, but the more we can do that, and there are people who are really doing some interesting work in here. Here's just one example which I'd flagged up. This is Mike Underwood from Futures Housing. So they're really trying to encourage their staff to use social media more, and this is really enlightening. This is good. This is what we want, because it isn't so long ago that lots of organisations actually banned staff from using social media, and this was so wrong, and it's so obviously wrong. What I really like about Mike's example here at Futures Housing is that they've actually said, do you know what, our intranet staff don't really like it. Why don't we switch it off and use, they've been trialing Facebook Workplace, for example. It could be Yammer. Really interesting that staff have embraced that and they're using it and they're getting some really positive interactions and collaboration, some really positive outcomes for a platform that many of their staff are comfortable using. So that's, again, so it's how do we bring staff into this? How do we have our staff as ambassadors? How do we have our staff as switched on, knowledgeable members of our communities?
Okay, great. Thanks for that. So continuing on the theme of digital transformation, we then looked at what are the barriers to actually realizing these transformation pieces. And there was a few changes here compared to what we saw 12 months ago. So this year we found that the main barriers being flagged up were culture, the understanding of new technologies and new practices, and also agility. So organizational agility to actually change and to pivot and to reinvent itself. Culture was a key theme that persisted from 12 months ago. So culture is obviously still seen as a real stumbling block. And I think quite often the projects that we see, it's getting the culture piece right, and the culture change is actually much harder than the technology itself. One theme that did disappear from last year was funding. So funding was flagged up as a real barrier last year, but has kind of moved away from this year. So again, maybe an indication that there's more of an appetite and more investment going into these transformation pieces. So what we're seeing is that it looks like it's quite often it's these legacy systems and these legacy ways of working that are really kind of holding back a lot of these transformation pieces. So I think a real focus on the people and the processes and the practices are quite often the first kind of piece in the jigsaw to realizing these wider projects.
Yeah, what's been really interesting in my work, and I've been looking at this over the past 2 to 3 years now, what are the barriers to being brilliant on social media? And four have emerged, and it's different in every team and every organization. But for me, I've called them the 4 T's, which is time, it's training, it's trust, and it's technology. And it can be a combination of all of those things, actually, for some teams. Overall this year, I would say time is the biggest barrier. And I would say that certainly from the teams that I've worked with this year, about 70% of them are saying time is our biggest barrier. We know how to be great on social media. We know what to do. What's stopping us is the 20 other things we need to also be good at as well. So time's really interesting. For some, it's training. I had a chap come to a workshop the other day who said, this is the first training I've done in 3 years. Oh my God, no pressure. I hope he found the day useful, because that's quite worrying. We all need to learn. We all need to continually develop. We do need training. And of course, it takes many forms. Trust, it's still an issue in some organisations. You know, we've been talking about this for 10 years and it hasn't gone away for some. We have to trust our staff. You know, our staff are doing important jobs. They're all grown up. Very few of the people that I've ever come into contact with would go off and do something daft. We have to trust our staff, and social media absolutely falls into that category. For some, it's tech, the fourth T. There are still some people out there with really old technology, and it can be really difficult to be able to be really, really effective and skillful and creative if you're using a 10-year-old BlackBerry. So those are the four. Quite interestingly, actually, I've been doing quite a bit of work in Wales this year, and a fifth T has emerged, which is translation. And some of the teams on social are having to do everything in Welsh and English. It's been really interesting, fascinating actually to hear about some of the opportunities that gives, but also some of the issues, because it's not just doubling the workload. It's more like 3 times the workload in terms of the additional work that has to go into being brilliant on social media in Welsh.
Okay, great. Okay, so the final question that we're going to look at today, there are more in the ebook that we're going to email out to you, but just to kind of summarize our top 10. So the final one here was in terms of what impacts are we seeing of these digital transformation projects. So it looks like some of the best ones here will be better collaboration. So we're seeing much better collaboration. We're seeing better engagement and better response times. And we're also seeing efficiencies being driven. This did change a little bit from last year. There were a few themes that kind of moved out, but the key ones this year are all about engagement, collaboration, efficiency. So all those common topics that we associate with doing social media really well. So it looks like people are really kind of getting to grips with social media. And of course, if we can give people fast response times and create those really powerful engagement moments, again, that's how we can start to grow our channels. We can start to get people to see them as great places to come to and speak to us, to interact with us, and to ask us questions. And obviously, social media, in terms of helping with collaboration, it can quite often be used as the kind of conduit to join up all these different departments. So to get comms and customer service working really collaboratively, to get the right tone of voice, to maximize those PR opportunities, and to really create those customer experience moments. So but I think the key here, look, if we look back at the barriers that we saw on the previous slide, it's all about embedding that agility within an organization. So we know that the pace of change is only going to accelerate, it's only going to speed up. So it's much easier now to try and embed that agility, to embed those systems and practices that can support us now, because we know that that demand and that rate of change is only going to increase. Okay, so what does all of this mean? So we've looked at our top 10 key findings, and what does all of this mean for comms professionals in 2018? So if we go back right to the start on the first couple of survey questions that we looked at, we must meet demand with equal resource. So again, we know demand is increasing kind of by 10-15% year on year. So we need to sufficiently resource in the right areas to meet that demand and to grow these channels, because whether we're on social media or we're not, and part of the conversation or we're not, people are going to carry on speaking to us on there. Also, I think CRM integration. So I flagged it up earlier as a real opportunity, but if we can start to join the dots, connect all these different touch points, give people that holistic view of the customer, then we can start to create some really effective, powerful interactions and resolutions. And obviously off the back of that, lots of cost savings as well. Social data. So we know that social listening, it wasn't a question that we looked at here, but within the guidebook, it's covered in there. So social listening, again, is something that's growing. And again, this can be a real kind of hotbed of customer insights around your brand, around the services, the frontline services that customers really care about, if you're making decisions around those. And also to identify real key influencers. I know certainly a lot of the content that we post here at Social Signing, when we do collaborate with great partners and influencers like the guys at Comms 2.0 or whoever it might be around a campaign, that's when we can really start to light the blue touch paper on the reach, the engagement, and of course, the outcomes that we're looking to get. And then obviously, in terms of removing those barriers, I think the cultural piece is a key one. If we can look at that first, And then obviously if we can get that right, then we can start looking at the different systems and pieces of tech that we can put in place to kind of support this. I mean, have you got any comments you'd like to make on that, Darren, in terms of the key takeaways for 2018?
Yeah, I think it's everything we've really hopefully just touched upon in the past 30 minutes, isn't it? It's a combination, but for me, it's one thing we haven't really touched upon in a huge way is kind of the governance aspect behind all of this. We've seen just in the past week, haven't we? We've seen the Wetherspoons issue with social media, and we've also seen there was the British Milk Council, wasn't it? We're not quite sure if that was real or spoof, who knows? But it could easily be real. So it's how do we make sure that we have the governance angle cracked, and as you know, I always ask the question of the comms teams that I work with: do you have the passwords for every single organisation or social media account? And that's really, really important. It's not 100% fail-safe, but we have to manage the risk. The only way to manage risk is to mitigate it as much as possible. Ideally, running it through a social media management platform, having all the accounts, passwords held centrally. So in the event of an incident where a member of staff perhaps goes rogue, you can do something about it. You don't want to be the comms person who's facing the wrath of a chief exec who wants you to take something down that you can't take down. That would be quite an unpleasant day. So we need to think about the governance aspect as part of this as well.
Okay, great. Thanks, Darren. So, and remember, just a few takeaways. When we digested all of this, there's always a few kind of golden rules that we need to remember.
Yeah, so being brave, easy for us to say, harder for you to do. But some of the best accounts are brave. It's, you've seen the NHS Give Blood example. That for me is an example of being brave on social media. We pick our battles wisely. We can't get involved in everything. But when there's a time to stand up and challenge something, we do need to be brave. Being creative, it's stating the blooming obvious, isn't it, really? But the best, most engaging content out there is creative. But for me, the challenge is it's time. It always comes down to time. If we had half a day now to sit here and dream up a new bit of social media content, we could do that. But you've got lots of other things to do. So how do we make the time? We've got to do this. Nobody's going to come along and give us an extra 3 hours a week. We've got to manage the demand coming into Teams, and we've got to manage our diaries and our time so that we can be brilliant on social media.
Okay, so we're going to stick around now for 5 minutes or so and answer some of your questions. So if you do have a question, just drop it into the chat box and we'll pick out a few of those to work through. A couple that we've had in so far. There's one actually from NHS Digital in terms of crisis comms plans. I mean, Darren, what are you seeing in terms of the percentage of organisations that actually have a crisis comms plan in place? Because we know what a key ingredient social media is within that mix.
Yeah, I think generally public sector's in a really good place on this. There's lots of lessons over the years of the really big emergency situations and the big crisis situations. And public sector, I think, generally does this very, very well. We have crisis comms plans in place, and social media is an absolute fundamental part of that these days. We know, touch wood, if something awful happened in Birmingham right now, it would be on Twitter within 30 seconds. So as teams, we understand this and we're ready to respond. I guess where it could fall between the cracks is when the mini things happen, and maybe they can fall between the cracks in a really, really busy team. So for me, the biggies, I think we generally know what they could be. We've done the scenario planning, and we're in a good place in terms of planning for what happens if X happens. It's the smaller issues that can suddenly blow up that might be, that might look quite small and insignificant, but can very quickly escalate on social media. So for me, it's some of the smaller stuff, and how do we challenge that? How do we cope with something small that blows up in a really big way out of hours for a team that is quite stretched? That for me is where there are perhaps some potential areas to improve upon.
Okay, great. A couple of questions that we had earlier on just regarding the survey was, where was the sample located? So that was right across the width and breadth of the UK. Someone asked if kind of top 10 lists are okay based on the fact that Facebook and other networks are now penalising kind of clickbait. So yeah, I think lists are okay. It's more the kind of post where it says like this if you agree, or kind of retweet this if you don't. It's those kind of encouraging those kind of clicks that that networks are now penalising. In terms of the question around dedicated social media, agents. So they weren't dedicated agents responding to social. It was more a case of people within the comms team wearing that social hat kind of day to day and picking up those kind of inbound inquiries. And then we also had a question about the NHS Blood account, in terms of, we obviously mentioned it was just one person, Melissa, managing that great account and that great campaign. So in terms of, if you do have just one person managing an account, Darren, you mentioned that it's, time is our most precious commodity. So do you have any kind of insights in terms of, if you are low on resource and you do have a number of accounts or a very active account to manage, how you can start to kind of still provide that great service and that great interaction?
It's difficult, isn't it? I think what I have found, I think there's a characteristic that I've spotted, that some of the very best social media accounts across all parts of the public sector, they are people that are committed to their jobs, they're knowledgeable, they're smart, they're dedicated, they're actually really passionate about social media. And I bet none of them ever works a 37-hour week. I suspect they cram it in on top, and these are people that probably work 50, 60-hour weeks. That isn't necessarily the answer to the question, but I think that is a definite characteristic. And probably all the examples that we flagged up today across the public sector, I bet all of those people are working additional hours to make that really good stuff happen.
Yeah, absolutely. We've had a couple of questions also around influencers. Obviously, influencers is a bit of a hot topic and a buzzword at the moment. I think what I've seen, certainly from a lot of the many hundreds of brands that we work with here at Social Signing, is that it's quite often it's the kind of micro influencers. So those people maybe from 10 to 15,000 followers and below, that can give some of your campaigns that real authenticity and that real engagement. Obviously, influencers take different forms for different organisations. An influencer could be an MP with a large number of followers. It could be a local kind of initiative to your kind of area. Darren, are you seeing organisations use influencers effectively?
Yeah, this exact conversation cropped up yesterday at the workshop in Bristol, actually. So I was showing the example of, it was an NHS England South, and it was one of the categories you judged, actually, and it won the award for best social media campaign, which was last year around a campaign to flag up the dangers of skin cancer, which is on the increase. Within that, men are the most at risk of skin cancer. And within that, there's two particular groups. Farmers and builders are most at risk of contracting skin cancer in the UK. So NHS England South ran a really smart campaign to target that. What was really interesting was somebody in the room yesterday that had worked on the campaign, which I hadn't known about, which was fantastic. So was able to get some extra insight from Georgia there in the team. And what they said was that actually they did a lot of work in the planning stage to identify who their influencers were. And then they drew up a pretty big list of some big influencers across the NHS, but also wider than the NHS. So partners who could help amplify the message and really help share that message and to get the engagement far and wide. What they did was they divided the influencers up across various team members, and literally each of them went off to contact 20 influencers each. So they really spread the load. Now that takes time, it takes planning, and for me it's back to that thing, isn't it? It's like the best work is the stuff that's planned and good thinking has gone into it and the research has taken place. So yeah, it works. We know it works. It's creating the time to find out who your influencers are and then contacting them in advance to see if they can help support your work.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Darren. A question from Sally Chalmers was, how important are social media skills in recruitment and how do applicants demonstrate these? So I think it's certainly something that stuck in my mind was a brand that we worked with previously, Virgin Trains, who are one of the very best advocates on social media. One of their key kind of prerequisites in terms of recruiting new people was they've got to be the right kind of personality for social media. It's not for everyone. You've got to get the right people in the right jobs with the right skill set and the right kind of experience and the right personality. I think if you've got the right personality, you can train the skills, but certainly getting the right personality type in the right roles is key in recruitment.
Would 100% agree. Yeah, I think the other thing on top of that is then, from a recruiter's point of view, people have digital CVs, whether they manage them or not. So how does your digital CV look? Have you Googled yourself recently? What comes up? And you should do that, not as a vanity exercise, but to have a look and to manage that, to manage your results, because recruiters do look. I think the other aspect then is kind of slightly linked is around comms people. I'm a bit of a bore on this subject, but I think we've not mentioned LinkedIn today, and LinkedIn is the 4th largest social media platform in the UK in terms of registered users, and I think it's still a little bit underused in the public sector. It's niche, but when it's the right platform, it can be really powerful. So I think as comms people and comms teams and thinking about campaigns, if part of what you've got to do is to engage with local business, LinkedIn can be a really good place to take a look and see if there can be a potential engagement return there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think LinkedIn and Facebook, because of the level of data, rightly or wrongly, that they capture on us, that's where you can really target particular segments, demographics, job titles, strategic partners, whoever it might be. Final question before we wrap up. I know it's 2 minutes to 2 and you're all eager to get back to work. From Andy Johnson, in terms of advice on encouraging employees to get involved with social media, to share content and things like that. I think there definitely is a correlation between brands that have employees very active in terms of sharing content, answering questions. Again, that can sometimes be considered risky by some organizations, but I think what some of the brands that we work with do is they will have social media ambassadors. So actually their employees, and part of their job is to actually, to watch and to manage the kind of questions and the content and the interactions that are taking place, and actually maybe reach out and answer some of those questions and actually kind of resolve some of those queries before they get into the contact center. Also, it's a great way just to manage your brand, manage your followers, to understand what your customers are talking about. So again, maybe just to kind of get that initial buy-in, you can kind of de-risk it or mitigate it by actually formalizing that role and actually having someone within a specific department to be one of your social media ambassadors. And again, I always think the brands that do social are the ones that use it like you and I use it, rather than being a purely kind of cold broadcast tool. So if you can have ambassadors, they've got a face, they've got a name, it can help to make your customer's social experience with you really human, really personal, and really authentic. Okay, it's 1 minute to 2. So just to wrap up, obviously a lot of the findings we've gone through today and more are in the guidebook that we're going to email out to you tomorrow. So you can download that, you can share it, and you can revisit some of those stats. We've got some great perspectives in there on the findings. So people like Rob Jefferson from Doncaster Council, Jared from Bromford Housing, David Bailey from the digital policing. We've got Sarah from Oxford Uni. We've got Simon from the DVLA, and we've got Gregor, who's been talking on the chat, also giving a digital NHS perspective. So hopefully lots of value in there, lots of ideas, lots of takeaways for you to go away and apply day to day. So our next webinar will be on Thursday, the 10th of May. We'll be sending you all an email about this. So we've teamed up with the guys at Parago Wales, and we're going to look at the very hot potato that is GDPR and social media. Obviously, lots of grey areas and unanswered questions around GDPR. Social media probably being the trickiest to nail down, but we've got lots of ideas and kind of examples, and also a bit of an insight in terms of the policies and regulations coming down the track in terms of that. So I'd like to thank Darren for joining me today. It's been great having him along.
Thank you for having me.
I'm sure we can talk him into another webinar later in this year. And yeah, thanks for joining us. We'll send out a recording to the webinar tomorrow, along with a link to the guidebook. Any questions you've got, please do contact either of us via Twitter, via our websites, if you want further information on anything we've spoken about today. So thanks for joining us, and we'll be in touch again soon.
Thanks. Bye.